Right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed lunch provided by the fabulous folk at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. They do such a good job. And we like to support them whenever we can, because not only is their food fabulous, but they're an important community service and support organisation as well. Welcome back. I'm delighted now to introduce our second keynote speaker for the day. Miranda Stewart is a professor specialising in taxation law and policy at the Melbourne Law School, University of Melbourne, and an honorary professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. Last year, she was a visiting fellow at the Australian Treasury, so she's coming to us straight from the lion's den. And her most recent book is Tax and Government in the 21st Century, which is with Cambridge University Press. I'm delighted to have someone of Miranda's expertise here today. Please make her very welcome.
Thank you. And I think we have some slides, so we'll see if this takes us. Ah, voila. Okay, you don't need that picture of the law school. So look, it's a great honour to be invited to speak to the summit, and congratulations to Capita and to Emma and the team for putting this on in such a timely manner and at such an important time. I think both of those things are true in this sort of time of potential budgets and elections. And it's great to, well, I should also acknowledge country and acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And although I will not talk very much about federal fiscal reform or the Federation, Ken Henry did raise that as an important issue. One of the things I will just briefly say before we get started is that the missing piece, or one of the missing pieces in our fiscal federation that we have, is Indigenous fiscal self-governance and proper budgeting of Indigenous governance and recognition of Indigenous custodianship of the land that we all benefit from. So that needs to be a part of any federation discussion that we go ahead and have. So what I'm going to do is I do have a couple of charts, so I will actually be putting a little bit of picture, I guess, to some of the things that Ken Henry raised, and to sort of think about that tax and transfer system as a whole and the scale of the tax system, and then I'll go into a few of the possible tax directions for reform in this space, some of which have been raised already. One of the things I'm going to emphasise, and you'll see it's pretty clear in the data, is the primary role of the income tax. We can't live without it. Some people have trouble living with it. And also the primary role of wage earners. So I agree, and we'll see why, that we are at risk of overtaxing labour and we do undertax capital. But a critical issue here, I guess, is that we are a wage-earning economy, and actually our fiscal system does depend on adequate wages. It was built over the last century on wages. It's interesting to be in this room with all the recognition of workers and to remind us that it's actually workers who built our fiscal system. So we want to be careful about how we recalibrate that to maintain that fairness and delivery of public goods in that system. So let me just make sure I'm pointing at the right thing. Does that... So move on to the next slide. So I'll just do a couple of comparisons of the system as a whole. One of the things that's been referred to is Australia's overall size of our tax system compared to other countries. So this is one of those OECD charts. Of course, there's a lot of countries in the world. There are 38 member states of the OECD. They're mostly rich countries. We are among the richest. We are among the richest countries in the world per capita and in terms of our total GDP. So the red arrow shows this is tax level, our total tax, that is federal, state, local, all put together as a share of our economy. It's a very basic statistic, but it helps us to make these comparisons. And that does show that we are, as was said earlier, we're at the bottom. We're next to the United States, actually. The US actually has lower tax to GDP ratio at the moment, but they have more capacity and more reliance than we do on debt. I'm not saying that's a good thing, using their monetary system that way. They do, and they can do that because they are the kind of sovereign bank for the world, which is one reason why we find the current regime so challenging and why we're moving into unstable and uncertain times. US Treasury bonds are the metric of a risk-free asset, and we'll have to see if that stays that way. So the US has actually a much bigger state than we do, even though their tax is less than us. They spend a lot more on defence in general than we do, and quite a lot on social security too. But we are much lower than most of our competitors. We're also considerably lower even than New Zealand in terms of tax level to GDP. I can turn this around and say that means that we are a wealthy country with a relatively low tax level. Some might say that we're driving our wealth through those low taxes. That's that economic incentive. Another way to think about it is that we do have spare fiscal capacity. We have fiscal capacity because we have a wealthy population. We actually can contribute more into that public debate to address inequality and to provide the public goods that we need to have a stable and secure life. Let's see if we can move. Oh, that's. Can we go back one? So this is Commonwealth taxes. So I'll come back briefly to state taxes, but mostly focusing on Commonwealth taxes. I don't know how easy that is to see. I know the lighting is a little bright. The big chunk of that pie is individual income tax. The orange is company income tax, and the sliver of green is superannuation funds, which pay 15% on earnings and contributions. So what you can see is that 3/4 of Commonwealth taxes are income tax, right? 3/4 of the tax base is income tax. The pale blue is GST. So the GST, we obsess about it, I think, a little, and this is something where perhaps not everyone agrees with me, but in my view, the GST is not doing enough work in our system. And 13% of the overall tax collections, but I'm not necessarily suggesting that we should reduce the role of the income tax. What we need to do is expand the base a bit more, and that could potentially be done a little bit in the GST. What we want to do in the income tax side is we want to recalibrate and also expand that base. The other little taxes that you have there are mostly the excises. Tobacco, alcohol, fuel are the big three excises. Trump is raising tariffs as being this kind of big issue. We raise $1.4 billion a year in customs. That's it, right? It's a tiny share of our revenue. We have a very open economy in general. In Australia, we don't have much room to move there in terms of managing our tariffs. We do raise some non-tax revenue as well, so the Commonwealth budget includes non-tax revenue, but mostly taxes. We've already heard in the last couple of panels as to what we're paying for, but just to give you that breakdown a little bit here, the big blue is social security, payments out. It does include some aged care stuff as well. The orange is health. The green is grants to the states, the Commonwealth's grant to the states, which basically pay for education and health, right? So then you can sort of think, okay, well, if that's all together, we've got social welfare, education and health, education, defence in pink there, everything else. The sort of orange bar, can't remember, it might be about 20, I haven't given you the number, it's about 22 billion. The little orange bar, that's debt interest on our gross debt interest on our national debt. Our debt is overall not that high relative to many other countries, gross and net debt. But the interest bill is going up because interest rates are going up, right? So the government issues treasury bonds, has a bit of other borrowing, is actually paying more interest now. So it's not a tiny share of our overall expenditure, and it is on an upward trend, even though overall debt is relatively low. So if we put these things together, just to put them side by side, if I can go, that's our taxes, income tax, 3/4, plus a bit of GST, the social welfare system, social security, health, education, and then defence, 3/4 of our expenditure. The income tax pays for that, pays for the core of our government activity. You've heard in the couple of the previous panels about how we are a healthier society, both than we were in the past and than many other countries. We are long-lived. We're considerably more long-lived than the US. This is a trend of tax revenue, total tax revenue. Some people are very familiar with this chart. But actually, if you did a trend from the beginning of the last century to today of longevity, for example, or improvements in health, it would look the same. So the trend upward in tax revenue is what has delivered that longevity, right? That, together with the growth of the economy, the two things are symbiotic. Those higher wages, that public health in the middle of the century, money expenditures went up, taxes went up in World War II. They came down a bit, but then they stayed up under Conservative government, right? Menzies initially, health and tertiary education and other forms of education, and then again from the 70s. The black line is essentially from the 70s. So what I want to do is drill a little bit more into what's happened in the last 50 years in the tax system. What you can see is that although the revenue's gone up and down and it's very bumpy, it's bumpy because the tax system is a stabiliser. It responds to the economy. Transfers increase, taxes reduce when the economy goes down. Responds to inflation, all sorts of things like that. The orange line is state taxes. So what you can see from the 70s is that they've just stayed pretty flat, 5%. They're essentially 5% of GDP. Commonwealth taxes around about 25%. So there is a question, states are responsible for about half of the expenditure, collect only 20% of the revenue, and that's that misallocation. On the other hand, Commonwealth taxes are it's efficient to collect nationally, many of our taxes. So the federal challenge for me is about revenue sharing and reconstructing that revenue sharing bargain. Okay, so 50 years of neoliberalism. Ken called himself a neoliberal. So I'm not going to say necessarily, is this a good or a bad thing? What happened, I guess, from the 1970s is that Australia began to and had to adapt to a global economy, right? We had to open the borders, the currency. We could not protect the currency. We floated the currency, we had to open the borders, and actually we have generated a tremendous amount of wealth, and we've also diversified our population and generated a great deal of sort of positive outcomes for Australia as being part of the world in that way. We responded to crisis, right? Economic and fiscal crisis. Sorry, that's too small for you to read, I realise. High inflation, high tax rates, lots of tax avoidance, challenges in enforcement, attempts at tax reform. So the Asprey Review recommended reform, which we didn't see until the 80s. So you could think of the 80s as being this kind of very significant regulatory and tax shift that made the tax system more responsive to this global economy, did encourage investment. That involved reducing tax rates. Sorry, I think I've gone forward. Oh, what have I done there? A bit tricky for me to see what I'm doing there. Adapting to that economic globalisation. But one of the consequences of the way that we did that in the 80s, which I think is one of the things we're reaping now, is that we privatised provision, governments sold off assets, inequality began to creep up again. We generated this kind of investment culture. So we have enriched a lot of the population and we have grown the economy a lot. But as a result, we have also created this kind of two-tier society. We have, in a sense, reintroduced class. Class was raised. And we can see in the stats, we've got that persistence at the top and the bottom. We're beginning to generate a society where the tax system, along with other systems, protects and maintains the elite at the top. And when I say the elite, high income and high wealth households, you could say it's the top 20%, the privileged high wage earners who also have assets, or the top 1%, the elite who control capital really in this country. And the top 5 to 20%, the bottom 5 to 20%, really struggling to get access to the middle. And some research that I've done, not tax related, about wealth has shown that that middle is shrinking a little bit, right? Is sort of losing ground relative to both the bottom and the top. The 1990s, we saw more fiscal discipline and this sort of continuing kind of public-private hybrid policy structure. Again, it served us well in some ways, but we have this imbalance that Ken referred to. We also had this massive increase in superannuation and retirement saving, which again, initially is about providing saving to the masses, access to the private capital market for all workers, but the settings of that in the 90s and the 2000s have generated this inequality in wealth. I'm not sure what I'm doing that is making that happen. Oh, you're zooming in, thank you. Perfect. It wasn't me. That's great. No, that's fantastic, thank you. If we could go to the next.
That's the invisible hand.
That's like AI improving one's personal capacity. I didn't even know I could do that, but then now you can. So we're in this sort of global digital era in the 2000s. As Ken Henry said, in 2000 we have the global financial crisis. You heard from Alan Kohler that in 2000 we have tax policy aimed at encouraging investment, reducing taxes on capital, intended to generate growth, with the inequality aspects of that not being front of mind, but that having, in a sense, some unintended effects, right? That overinvestment in the rental market, for example, instead of just equities. At that time, we also see internationally multinational enterprises accruing much more kind of power and tax planning becoming really important internationally. So the 210s, I also want to raise here these increasingly contested areas of tax policy. So in particular, environmental taxes and carbon pricing, these were introduced. At the time, mining tax and the carbon tax both were subsequently repealed. Obviously, these are political decisions, but they are in response to kind of popular vote in some ways. So this is highly contested. So if I bring us to the 2020s, here we are, it's 50 years. So we are in this time of increased, I would say, instability and uncertainty, both in international economy and tax policy and also domestically. We're kind of reaching the limits of this structure that we've built over this hybrid structure of the market and the state, we now have this excessive, I would say, reliance on market and private return. That's all very well if we could tax that return appropriately, but we are not doing that. And inflation and bracket creep are significant. Wealth inequality, the fact that we have this ageing population with rising fiscal costs, and we still have this kind of discord on the energy transition and the environment. Okay, so what about tax principles in this context? Tax policy people tend to talk about equity, efficiency and certainty or simplicity, certainty and convenience. In my view, you make tax easy to pay and that, then you get your payment, and wage withholding is the classic example of that. We do need more revenue, but I think it's important to understand that just saying we need more revenue will not drive tax reform because people don't like paying taxes. This room may be different, but in a sense there is that question of what is it for? What actually is the social goal? The evidence 100 years ago is that the age pension and child allowances were introduced first, Then the Commonwealth Government faced its first fiscal deficit. Then they introduced taxes, right? So it sort of followed almost the social policy goals. So what is it that we do want to achieve? So I would want to emphasise as well what I call benefit, legitimacy and resilience of this tax system that we have. We need to justify and renew the role of government and the role of the public sector in delivering public goods for all of us. That performs an important distributional role. So taxes and transfers are critical as a system, but we need that education and health and defence, that public information, that sort of public role, and we need to be able to adapt and respond to crisis and uncertainty globally in the world that we live in now. So what I want to go into then, let's have a think about just some of these different areas that we're operating in. So the tax system relies fundamentally on wages, fundamentally. So that's our individual income tax chunk of that. The black line shows all of it. It's essentially half the tax take is wage withholding and fringe benefits. The rest is income tax on capital gains and investment income. One reason that that's small is fewer people have it, right? We actually could not fund the state that we want just by taxing the rich. It would be nice, but actually there's not enough money there. We actually we have to tax ourselves, but we also need to tax the rich better than we currently do. It's interesting that Ken called for indexing brackets. I'm not sure about that, but I can see that one thing that would do, it obviously protects the tax rates, the progressive rates applicable to workers in the moderate and medium, and that's important because I do think workers are at the middle are potentially paying too much tax, and we're going to have to keep adjusting because we do live in a slightly inflationary world. But the other reason is that it might force governments to actually address the other problems in the system, rather than relying on bracket creep to generate revenue. We can reform deductions. Perhaps where I depart from Ken is that I am a strong believer in a progressive rate structure that has potentially multiple rates. It does have to be enforced, but there's plenty of evidence that high wage earners will continue to work even if you tax them a little bit more. And so I think we need to protect that progressive rate structure. One thing to remember when you're having debates about taxation is to understand the difference between marginal rates, those progressive rates, and what we call the average tax rate. So if you're on the sort of 30% marginal rate, your average tax is sort of 23%. That's the tax you pay as a share of your total income. If you're facing that 37% marginal rate, your average tax rate is 27%. Obviously, if you have $1 million, we trend to 45 at the top of the rate structure. But our system does generate higher effective marginal tax rates for some categories of worker. People will have heard about that, and it's something I've talked about before. One category is women looking after children. Of course, some men as well, but secondary earners, people who have taken time out of the labour market to care for children and then seek to re-enter or increase hours in the labour market. This is a recent study by Ben Phillips, who's well known to people, I'm sure, of the actual effective tax rates that people face in the labour market. So some of the modelling I've done in the past is what we call cameos, examples of how the system could work. What this compares, the red is women who have childcare costs, formal childcare costs, and the effective tax rate is along the bottom increasing. The blue is the whole of population of women. So, in fact, 1/4 of women who are paying childcare cost of some kind are facing effective tax rates of more than 60% on increasing their working hours. We've brought that down quite a bit over the last few years because we've delivered a higher childcare subsidy and that kindergarten and so on. So you could think of childcare as a tax policy, right? It's a policy to encourage labour supply and reduce the tax on labour income for a particular highly mobile category of workers who might be in or out of the labour market. we still face these high tax rates. And many of these women are not earning high wages, right? So this is in the moderate sort of area. So we haven't solved that problem completely, and the evidence is in the statistics that we still have a large share of labour supply that is not fully utilised in the market. This is not about making people work in the market, right? This is about removing excessive tax rates from that labour supply. This is HECS, so you can't see the smaller documents, but there's been a bit of talk about HECS. In my view, this is one of those hybrid policies that was successful in some ways in bringing more people into the higher education system, in expanding the scope of that system with some co-contribution. HECS is premised on the idea that there is a wage premium to tertiary education. You do, over your life course, if you've had tertiary education, earn more than if you don't. So there is an argument, whether you agree or not, that maybe you should pay a bit more. But in my view, that system has come to its limits. We've come to the limits of that hybrid policy, and what we're producing is really high average tax rates over a period of 10 to 20 years of the core labour supply of our tertiary educated workers. What HECS does, it's like the Medicare levy. It's a flat tax on total taxable income. So if you have a HECS debt of $50,000 or $100,000, you pay the marginal repayment rate, which goes up with income, but you pay it on your whole taxable income. It can bring your average tax rate up. For example, you're at that $100,000 to $120,000 mark from 23% to 31%. Not just for 1 or 2 years to repay the debt, but for a long period of time. So in my view, that's something that we have gone too far. We should recalibrate. The Labor government has done a little bit there, perhaps not quite enough. Okay, so I'm conscious of time. We started a little bit late, but I don't want to spend too long, but I will try and get to a couple of other things. We've been talking a lot about capital and wealth inequality. As Roger said, we have a kind of stable and high level of wealth inequality. When you drill into the wealth statistics, what you find is that over the last 20 years, the rich have benefited, that is the top 20%, have benefited from house price appreciation. The poor have more financial wealth than they did before if they've been working, mostly because they have a bit of super guarantee, right? Their financial wealth is a smaller amount of superannuation. So they've got a little bit richer than they were 20 years ago, and similarly the young have a bit more than they had 20 years ago, but way outweighed at the top of the market. So housing and super are at the core of savings tax policy. And we should be taxing housing more. I think negative gearing is a problem. Not all tax policy people agree with me there. But I think Ken Henry's proposal, he talked about a scheduler system, potentially a dual system. We reduce that discount on the capital gain. We also reduce the deduction for negative gearing. That's a possible way to go. We definitely should be taxing superannuation more there as well. And I'm going to say it, even though it's politically apparently anathema, we should have an inheritance tax in this country. We made a massive mistake by abolishing instead of reforming it in 1980. And we have this big inheritance happening now because of that generational shift who have benefited from a massive increase in wealth in the last 30 years. Couple more things. Company tax. Very important. We still need to keep that large company tax at 30%. It's ironic that we have a government where the most tax reform they're doing is the stuff that's international, looking outward on large companies rather than domestically. The largest tax gap is in the small business sector. And in terms of capital income and business taxation, we do have to reform the taxation of trusts. We should be taxing trust distributions and preventing income splitting and managing that system better. I do agree with Ken Henry as well that for the middle and for companies that are not doing resource extraction, we actually maybe are overtaxing that sector too, that sector of entrepreneurship, growing businesses and innovation. And that is undermining our growth. So then finally on consumption and behaviour, I do think we should be increasing GST a bit, but what we need to plan for is the transition from tobacco, excise and alcohol. Alcohol could probably go up a bit more. Tobacco, we might have reached our policy limit. So you do have to be realistic in designing tax policy and thinking about what is the behavioural response and what are the social costs. People who live in Melbourne know how many small stores have been firebombed in the last few years because of an illegal tobacco war, and how much we need to respond to that. So we do need to transition. A carbon tax would actually do a lot of work for us there, of course, in the fuel sector. So my last slide and finishing remarks. I think what tax reform has to do, I agree with Ken Henry that some sort of systemic or comprehensive package is better than just incremental. It doesn't mean you reform everything at once, but we need to restore that fiscal compact that actually, why are we paying these taxes? It's because we need that stronger governmental provision, public provision. You do need to bring everyone with you in a tax debate, right? And relieving poverty is important. You have to bring the middle with you in that tax debate and explain why the middle also should care about widespread, solid public provision of education, health, infrastructure, climate goods for the benefit of everyone. Build that legitimacy and capacity, tax capital more, keep and increase corporate and resource taxes, and sort of manage that political instability. So I'll stop there. Sorry, Emma, for going over. All right, very good.